Most institutions spend months, sometimes years, preparing for accreditation. They build communities. They gather evidence. They write, revise, and rewrite the self-study. They try to anticipate every question. They try to document every process. They try to present their institution at its very best. And underlying all of that effort is a quiet assumption. If we do this well enough, if we explain enough, if we show enough, then the reviewers will see what we want them to see. But here's the reality. Reviewers are not reading your self-study the way you think they are. They are not simply checking boxes. They are not just verifying compliance line by line. They are not looking for perfection in the way institutions often imagine. What they are doing is something much more complex and much more human. They are forming an understanding of your institution, and what they see is often very different from what institutions think they are presenting. Welcome to Accreditation Unlocked. I'm Ken Clough, educator, consultant, and founder of the Accreditation Collaborative. In this podcast, we explore accreditation not just as a process, but as a practice. Not just what it requires, but how it is experienced. And in today's episode, we're going to talk about something that doesn't often get discussed directly: what reviewers actually see. Now, before we begin, let me frame this clearly. This is not a replacement for accreditation standards. This is not a shortcut, and it's not a critique of accreditors. Everything we're going to talk about today is already embedded in accreditation expectations. What this episode is about is understanding how those expectations are experienced during a review. The misconception. There is a common mindset that develops during accreditation preparation. It usually sounds something like this: they're going to check everything. We need to make sure nothing is missing. We have to present ourselves as fully aligned, fully functioning, and fully successful. And from that mindset, a series of behaviors follow. Institutions overproduce documentation. They over-explain. They write defensively. They try to anticipate every possible concern. And perhaps most importantly, they begin to equate compliance with perfection. If we meet all standards, then everything must appear perfect. But that's where the misunderstanding begins. Because while accreditation does require that institutions meet all standards, it doesn't require the kind of perfection institutions often try to present. "100% compliance versus perfection." Let's pause here, because this is one of the most important distinctions in all of accreditation. Accreditors will tell you, and rightly so, that institutions must meet 100% of standards. That expectation is real. It is appropriate, and it matters. But what does meeting 100% of the standards actually mean? For many institutions, it gets interpreted as no gaps, no challenges, and no inconsistencies. Everything working exactly as intended at all times. In other words, perfection. But that's not what compliance means. Compliance does not mean flawless outcomes. It does not mean that every process is fully optimized. And it certainly does not mean that the institution operates without challenge. What compliance actually means is this: systems are in place. Processes are functioning. Outcomes are assessed. Issues are identified. And actions are being taken. Let me say that again, because it's central to everything. Accreditation requires full compliance, but compliance is demonstrated through functioning systems, not flawless results. And this is where institutions sometimes unintentionally create problems for themselves. Because when they try to present perfection, they often reduce their credibility. Reviewers don't expect perfection, but they do expect awareness. They expect to see that you understand where you are strong and where you are still working to improve. And when that awareness is missing or hidden, it raises questions. So the goal is not to eliminate every imperfection. The goal is to demonstrate that your institution is functioning, aware, and improving. And that's exactly what reviewers are looking for. What reviewers actually see. So, if reviewers are not simply checking for perfection, what are they actually seeing? Over time, patterns emerge, and those patterns tend to fall into a few key areas that we're going to explore right now. Coherence versus fragmentation. The first thing reviewers are looking for is coherence. Do the pieces of the institution connect? Does the mission align with outcomes? Do the outcomes connect to assessment? Do assessment results inform decisions? Or are these things presented as separate, disconnected efforts? Because even when all the pieces are present, if they don't connect, the institution feels fragmented. But when they do connect, the institution feels intentional. Alignment versus noise. The second thing reviewers see is alignment. Every institution has initiatives. Every institution has priorities, but not everything can be a priority. And when everything is labeled as strategic, nothing really is. Reviewers are constantly filtering for signals versus noise. They're asking, what actually matters here? What is driving decisions? What is guiding the institution forward? And when that isn't clear, it creates confusion. Authenticity versus performance. The third area is one that often goes unspoken. Reviewers are very attuned to authenticity. They can sense when a self-study is trying to perform, when the language is overly polished, when everything sounds uniformly successful, when challenges are minimized or avoided. And this is where the earlier distinction comes back. If an institution presents itself as having no challenges, reviewers don't see perfection. They see a lack of awareness. On the other hand, when an institution speaks honestly about where it is and what it's working to improve, it builds trust. Evidence of use versus evidence of existence. Another critical distinction. Reviewers are not just looking for evidence that something exists. They're looking for evidence that it is used. It's not enough to say, we collect assessment data. The question is, what did you do with it? How did it inform decisions? What changed as a result? What improved? Because accreditation is not about documentation. It's about effective decision-making. Consistency across voices. And finally, reviewers are always looking for consistency. The self-study tells one story, but then they meet with faculty, they meet with staff, and they meet with leadership. They begin to ask themselves, is this the same story? When those voices align, credibility increases. But when they don't, questions begin to emerge very quickly. The first 30 minutes of a site visit. There's something else that's important to understand. Reviewers begin forming impressions very early, often within the first 30 minutes of a visit. Now, that doesn't mean conclusions are finalized, but a working understanding begins to take shape. And that understanding is influenced by things like how clearly leadership communicates, how openly challenges are discussed, or how aligned the team appears. But here's the nuance. Initial impressions are formed quickly, but they are tested and refined through evidence. It's not about getting it right immediately. It's about whether what is seen early is supported consistently throughout the visit. Red flags. There are also patterns that tend to raise concern, not as judgments, but as signals, such as overly scripted responses, difficulty explaining processes clearly, a disconnect between the report and actual practice, frequent references to things that were just implemented. These aren't failures, but they do suggest that systems may not yet be fully embedded. And again, the issue is not imperfection. The issue is whether the institution can communicate where it stands. What builds trust? If there's one connection that ties all of this together, it is this. Trust is a currency of accreditation. And trust is built through clarity, consistency, transparency, and evidence of learning. When institutions demonstrate that they know who they are, understand their challenges, and are actively working to improve, reviewers respond to that. Not because it's perfect, but because it's credible. The self-study as narrative. This brings us back to the self-study, because the self-study is often misunderstood. It's not a defense document, it's not an argument, and it's not a performance. It's a narrative. It's a reflection of how the institution actually operates, and it includes strengths, challenges, and tensions. And this is where leadership comes to play. Every institution is managing competing priorities, limited resources, changing environments, and evolving expectations. What I've often referred to as structural tension. The self-study is where that tension becomes visible, not as a weakness, but as a reality. And when institutions can articulate how they navigate that, how they make decisions, and how they adjust when things fall short, that's when the story becomes real. And that's what reviewers are trying to understand. So, let's bring this all together. Accreditation is not about convincing reviewers that everything is perfect. It's about helping them understand that your institution is functioning, that it is aware, that it is aligned, and that it is committed to improvement. You are not being evaluated on whether everything is flawless. You are being evaluated on whether your systems work, whether your decisions are informed, and whether your institution understands itself. Because in the end, accreditors publish standards, but reviewers experience institutions. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Accreditation Unlocked. If this perspective resonates with you, if it helps you see accreditation a little differently, consider sharing this episode with a colleague. And if you're working through your own accreditation process and looking for guidance, support, or simply a sounding board, you can learn more at the Accreditation Collaborative. Until next time, this is Ken Clough, reminding you that accreditation is not just about meeting standards, it's about understanding your story.